Somewhere in a database of ancient bone fragments, a question has been sitting for almost a decade, one most people assumed was already answered. Who were the ancient Egyptians, genetically speaking, and does anyone alive today actually carry their bloodline? For most of the last century, the popular story felt simple, almost self-evident. Egypt was Egypt. The pharaohs were the ancestors. The Nile ran unbroken from Tutankhamun's tomb to the villages along its banks today, and somewhere in that unbroken thread, surnames, old, coastal, Coptic, aristocratic-sounding names, seemed to promise a kind of inheritance. A genetic thread back to gold and stone and kings. Then scientists actually sequenced the DNA. And the story that came back was not the one anyone expected. It did not confirm an unbroken royal bloodline. It did not hand modern families a genetic certificate connecting them to Ramses or Tutankhamun. What it did instead was stranger, and in its own way more remarkable. It revealed that ancient Egypt's genetic story and its mythic story had quietly drifted apart, and that the real inheritance may be running through channels almost nobody was looking at. This is the story of what ancient DNA actually found beneath the sand, and why the answer complicates almost everything the phrase, Pharaoh bloodline, has come to promise. The conventional narrative, for generations, rested on a comforting kind of continuity. Ancient Egypt was one of the longest-running, most visually dominant civilizations in human history. Over 3,000 years of dynasties, from the unification under Narmer around 3100 BCE through the Ptolemaic period ending with Cleopatra. Given that staggering span, and given how visually distinct and iconographically powerful Egyptian civilization remains in the popular imagination, it seemed reasonable to assume a kind of genetic straight line. Ancient Egyptians, modern Egyptians, one continuous population occupying one continuous river valley. Surnames reinforced that intuition. Across Egypt today, particularly among Coptic Christian communities whose religious and cultural identity is often framed as a direct continuation of pre-Islamic, Pharaonic-era Egyptian culture, certain family names carry an implied weight of deep time continuity. Names tied to old priestly or scribal traditions. Names preserved in monasteries along the Nile that trace their founding to the earliest centuries of Christianity in Egypt, centuries after the pharaohs but still, by any measure, ancient. It is not hard to see why so many people, encountering these names, felt they were looking at a living thread back to dynastic Egypt itself. And commercially, that intuition has been aggressively marketed. For years, DNA testing companies and even a few television specials have advertised the ability to detect Pharaoh DNA or link a customer's genetic results to specific royal mummies, most famously Tutankhamun, whose Y chromosome haplogroup was informally reported by a Swiss genealogy company in 2010 as belonging to haplogroup R1b1a2, a lineage common in Western Europe today. That claim was never published in a peer-reviewed scientific journal, was never independently verified by the Egyptian research team that actually sequenced Tutankhamun's genome, and has been treated with significant skepticism by geneticists ever since. It became popular anyway. It is still circulating today, often presented with far more confidence than the underlying science ever supported. That was the first real crack. Not a contradiction from ancient DNA. A contradiction from marketing outrunning evidence, years before the rigorous studies even existed. Real answers did not begin arriving until researchers gained access to something far more difficult to obtain than a single royal mummy, a genuine ancient DNA dataset, drawn not from kings, but from ordinary Egyptians. In 2017, a team led by geneticists including Verena Schunemann, publishing through Nature Communications, sequenced genetic material from 90 mummified individuals excavated at Abu Sur el-Melek, a site along the Nile occupied continuously from roughly 1400 BCE through the Roman period, spanning about 1,300 years. This was a landmark effort for a specific reason. Egypt's hot, humid climate is notoriously hostile to DNA preservation, and for decades, most researchers assumed usable ancient Egyptian genetic material simply did not survive well enough to sequence reliably. This study, using improved extraction techniques and, critically, mitochondrial DNA along with limited nuclear genome data, managed to work around that obstacle for the first time at meaningful scale. Mitochondrial DNA, passed down the maternal line largely unchanged across generations, let researchers trace long-distance ancestral connections across more than 1,000 years within a single site. Combined with a smaller set of nuclear genome sequences, the fuller genetic picture drawn from both parents, the study offered something no royal mummy headline ever could: a population-level view, not a single dramatic bloodline. And the population-level view did not confirm the assumed story. It complicated it. The ancient individuals from Abu Sur el-Melek showed genetic ancestry most closely related to populations of the ancient Near East and Eastern Mediterranean, the Levant, in particular, more so than to any single population living in Egypt or sub-Saharan Africa today. That, on its own, was not shocking. Ancient Egypt sat at a crossroads, and its trade, migration, and cultural contact with the Levant was recorded extensively in Egyptian and Near Eastern texts alike. What genuinely surprised the researchers was something else. The genetic makeup of these ancient individuals remained relatively stable across the roughly 1,300 years the site was sampled, even through periods of enormous political upheaval, including Persian, Greek, and Roman rule. That was not a contradiction. It was a signal, and a strange one. It suggested ancient Egyptian ancestry near this particular site was more genetically continuous through conquest and regime change than the political history alone would predict, at least along the maternal line studied. But here is where the story widened rather than resolved. When the researchers compared their ancient samples to modern Egyptian populations, they found that modern Egyptians carry meaningfully more sub-Saharan African ancestry, on average, than the ancient individuals from Abu Sur el-Melek did. The direction of change was not what a simple, unbroken bloodline story would predict. If anything, the genetic distance between modern and ancient Egyptian populations appeared to have increased over roughly the past 1,500 years, not decreased, most plausibly linked to increased mobility along Nile and trans-Saharan trade and migration routes in the centuries following the initial sampled period, including patterns tied to expanded trade networks and, later, the trans-Saharan slave trade. Sit with that for a moment. The ancient Egyptians sampled at this site were not less connected to modern Egypt because of some dramatic population replacement or lost civilization. They were, genetically, a somewhat different population than many modern Egyptians, not because ancient Egypt vanished, but because more recent centuries added ancestry streams the Pharaonic era population, at least in this specific sample, had not yet absorbed. That is not erasure. It is an entirely different, far more layered kind of history than unbroken royal bloodline ever allowed for. If the idea that ancestry can move in directions nobody expects, genetic distance actually widening over time rather than simply narrowing, is the kind of thing that keeps you thinking after the video ends, this is exactly the terrain this channel exists to explore, so it's worth sticking around and subscribing for what comes next. At this point, researchers generally lean on a small number of frameworks to explain what a single site's ancient DNA can and cannot tell us, and it's worth holding all of them at once, because none is fully settled. The first is regional continuity with later admixture. The population sampled at Abu Sur el-Melek represents a genuine, stable ancient Egyptian lineage that was subsequently diluted, regionally and unevenly, by later migration and trade-driven mixing, meaning different parts of modern Egypt may carry different degrees of connection to that ancient population depending on local history. The second is sampling limitation. A single site, however well excavated, cannot represent the full genetic diversity of a civilization that spanned the length of the Nile and interacted with Nubia, the Levant, and the wider Mediterranean across 3 millennia. Meaning the ancient Egyptian genome revealed here may describe this specific community far more accurately than it describes ancient Egypt as a whole. The third is that ancestry and identity were never single-stream to begin with, that dynastic Egypt itself, across 3,000 years of conquest, trade, and shifting borders, was already a genetically layered civilization long before the questions modern science is now asking, and that looking for one clean, pharaonic bloodline was always a flawed premise, not a scientific one. None of these frameworks hands anyone a tidy genetic certificate. All three point toward the same underlying truth. Egypt's genetic history, ancient and modern, was never a straight line. It was a river system, with tributaries entering and leaving across thousands of years. Which brings us back to where this story started, with names. Surnames tied to old Coptic, priestly, or scribal traditions in Egypt today reflect something real, cultural and religious continuity, in many cases stretching back centuries, sometimes plausibly further. Communities that preserved liturgical language, monastic records, and identity through waves of conquest carry a genuine, documentable historical thread. But a surname is not a genome. It cannot, on its own, confirm descent from any specific pharaoh, dynasty, or royal lineage, and no currently published, peer-reviewed ancient DNA study has established a verified genetic link between any living family and a named pharaoh. The commercial claims that promise otherwise are, at this point, marketing dressed as science. What the actual evidence offers instead is something science tends to offer when it is working honestly, not the answer people wanted, but a truer, stranger one. Not a bloodline running unbroken from Tutankhamun's tomb to a living descendant. A civilization whose population was already a crossroads 3,000 years ago, whose genetic signature shifted meaningfully in the centuries after its temples went quiet, and whose modern descendants carry a mixture of ancestries that no single ancient mummy, however famous, could ever fully represent. That is the twist this investigation kept arriving at. Not that ancient Egypt was less real, or less connected to the people living along the Nile today. The surprise was not the presence of continuity. Continuity, in fact, held up remarkably well across 13 centuries at the one site closely studied. The surprise was where the discontinuity showed up instead, not in some ancient collapse, but in the more recent past, in trade routes and migrations most people never think to ask about, quietly reshaping a population everyone assumed had already finished changing. Which is, in the end, the larger point ancient DNA keeps making across almost every civilization it touches. Human history does not move in straight lines toward a fixed origin. It moves the way rivers move, splitting, merging, picking up new sediment, sometimes doubling back. The pharaohs were real. Their genetic story, so far as researchers have been able to reconstruct it, was real, specific, and rooted in the ancient Near East and the Nile Valley. But the population living along that same river today is not a diminished echo of that ancient world. It is a different, later chapter in the same very long river system, no less legitimate, no less Egyptian, simply layered by another 1,500 years of human movement the ancient sample never lived to see. Picture the Nile at dusk near Abu Sur el-Melek, where the excavation that produced this evidence took place. Flat gold light on slow water, palm silhouettes leaning over the bank, the low outline of a modern village built almost directly over ground that has been continuously inhabited, in some form, for well over 3,000 years. Fishermen still work this stretch of river the way fishermen have for millennia. Beneath their boats, in soil that has held bodies since before the Great Pyramid was young, lies genetic material that took modern science until 2017 to finally read with any real confidence. The river did not stop moving while historians debated who its people were. It just kept carrying everything downstream, generation after generation, indifferent to the tidy stories built on its banks. So no, the evidence does not hand anyone a verified pharaoh bloodline. What it hands us instead is something ancient Egypt, of all civilizations, should probably have taught us to expect from the beginning. That a culture capable of building monuments meant to outlast time itself was never, even at its height, a single unbroken thread. It was already a confluence. And the DNA, 3,000 years later, finally caught up to what the river always knew, that Egypt's true inheritance was never a bloodline waiting to be claimed. It was a long, layered, ongoing story, and it is still being written by the people living along that same water today.